I wonder if it is the time to start the first plenary session. What do you think, Julian?
I think so.
Okay.
If you can find the plenary speaker, Anya.
Okay. So at this stage, I have a great pleasure to introduce to you our first special guest, Professor Julian Stern from Bishop Grosseteste University. It was previously York St. John University, so maybe you know him just from York University. Julian Stern is world-known, outstanding researcher, and many of us know him. But as a host, I would like to say he is the author of many books on loneliness and solitude in education, on religious education and philosophy of schooling. He is also the editor-in-chief of the British Journal of Religious Education and the General Secretary of the International Seminar on Religious Education and Values. And not last and not least, he is a great friend of our institute, what is an honor for us. Julian's presentation is titled Personhood, Alone and Together. Presentation time is about 30 minutes, and after that, we will have 15 minutes for asking questions and discussion. For technical reasons, as Julian said it before, you are asked to keep cameras and microphones off and turn it on only when speaking. It is also possible to use chat to make comments and ask questions. Julian, it is an honor to have you here with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anya. And if you could keep your microphone on and camera, you will be able to warn me if I talk for too long and if there are some things that people wish to do.
Okay, I will.
It is thank you. It is a huge pleasure just to see everyone. A lot of friends, friends from a long time ago, a lot of new friends, I hope, as well. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I will start sharing my screen and I will see if I can do that. Again, can you see the screen? Now, can you see the screen well, if you see what I mean? Anya, can you see my screen?
Yes, but not
without any text, I know, but just the screen. That's okay. I've got there. Yeah.
Oh yes.
Okay.
Now I've got the text as well.
So apologies that I used to work in a university named after a saint. I now work in a university named after a bishop. I'm slowly going down the levels in the Church of England. I am delighted to be talking about personhood, alone and together. We grow up, as this child is growing up in the picture, we grow up with a combination of being together with people and being apart from people. This is so important to us. Personhood develops through connection with and separation from other people at every stage in our life. At every stage in our life. A person's life is characterized by the ebb and flow of togetherness. Of togetherness meaning at birth and through our childhood and through our adulthood. This is recognized by psychologists such as John Bowlby, who wrote about the separation, and Donald Winnicott, great psychologists through the 1950s and 60s, writing about how people came together and how people separated, and how there was both good togetherness and bad togetherness, good separation and bad separation. in all of life, but it starts with our childhood. Togetherness may be experienced as love, or it may be an abusive codependency. Separation may be exciting growing up, becoming independent. It may be exile and loneliness. So there are good and bad examples of all of these things. It is worth saying that there are theorists, philosophers of life who are more communally focused and those who are more individually focused in their beliefs. People like the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, the anarchist Max Stirner, and as part of our community and here at this symposium, Ben Miusevic and Piotr Domoraci, all of whom concentrate on aloneness and even loneliness and separation as a central characteristic of personhood. However, there are other people, amongst whom are the Scottish philosopher John McMurray, the Middle European philosopher Martin Buber, and myself and Gosia Faweko, who see personhood as existing primarily in and through dialogue and community. But both of these positions are represented not only in the literature, but in our symposium, and both of them have an interest in understanding aloneness and togetherness. Both have an interest in solitude and in community, in the whole range of views, and all, I should say as well, are supported by and are part of our academic community. There is an art, I believe, to being alone. Kierkegaard, the philosopher, described silence in this way: because the human being is able to speak, the ability to be silent is an art, and a great art, precisely because this advantage of his so easily tempts him. So I'm particularly interested in the art and the literature and the music of being alone, and how we understand that. These are certainly not simple ideas. I will talk about in this presentation different definitions of solitude, silence, and loneliness. And in my conclusion, I'll talk about some of the work, some of the publishing, and some of the social things that have arisen from both my interest and the interest of everyone who is here at this symposium. So I want to talk about solitude, silence, and loneliness in context. These words, each of those three words, are rather dangerous friends. And I appreciate that many people here at the symposium have languages other than English. In English, these are dangerous words. They are dangerous in every language, and each language has its own uses. English has many different uses, and each language will have different uses of those three words. It's important that we admit this, but also that we try to say something significant that, I hope, will cross language boundaries. I'll give some descriptions of the three terms in particular contexts, and those contexts are both disciplinary contexts, how loneliness, for example, is seen by psychologists or by theologians, and social contexts as well, how silence is, for example, experienced in different practice settings. So the contexts are going to be important. I'll talk about solitude and the range of solitudes from exile to ecstasy. I'll talk about silence, the silence of the soundless, the unvoiced, and of quietude. And I'll talk about loneliness, both as an emotion and as an existential state. It's worth saying that I've put a whole long paper, much more than I'm saying, on the Teams system, so you can read more about what I'm saying there. And I've put this PowerPoint slideshow on Teams as well, if you wish to follow things there. But first, let's talk about solitude of the three terms. There are broadly two different ways of describing solitude throughout history. There have been. One is as a form of punishment, a negative form of solitude. The other is as a state to be sought for the sake of personal development or perhaps spiritual development. Both these forms of solitude have existed throughout human history, and both have been described in various ways by literary figures, by philosophers, by artists. I start with the Roman poet-writer Ovid, who late in his life, after a glittering career as a literary superstar, was sent into exile by the Black Sea. He'd been living in Rome with his family. He was sent on his own without his family into exile, and he describes his exile in letters back home, and he describes his exile in terms of his sickness, his senility, his lassitude, his sloth, his depression, and his acidity. It doesn't seem to me that he has a form of what we would now call loneliness, but he's certainly a fabulous description of some of the harmful versions of exile solitude. He writes of the book that he is sending back to Rome, which is still in print 2,000 years later, which he would find get great joy from. Little book, I don't begrudge it to you, you're off to the city without me, going where your only begetter is banned. In other words, his exile, even the book that he was writing and sending off, he felt was leaving him alone. He was banned where his book wasn't. He describes in another poem from the Black Sea, I have lost all, only bare life remains to quicken the awareness and substance of my pain. He seems to be being attacked by the then Roman emperor and says, what pleasure do you get from stabbing this dead body? There is no space in me now for another wound. His is one of the most eloquent descriptions of the pain of solitude, of the solitude of exile. Later, 1500 years later, after Ovid, Shakespeare, who seemed to write about everything, wrote about different forms of solitude. In a number of English dictionaries, he's described as using the word lonely for the first time. He uses it in his play Coriolanus, set in Roman times, and the hero Coriolanus, the anti-hero Coriolanus, is sent into exile and describes himself as, I go alone, like to a lonely dragon, that his fen makes feared and talked of more than seen. And this is the first major use of the word lonely, but it's not really describing loneliness as we now know it, it's describing his exile, much like Ovid's exile. A later play by Shakespeare, King Lear, is the story of a king whose three daughters treat him differently, and Cordelia, the one he seems to have loved most, is also the one who refuses to pander to the elderly king and ends up, sorry to spoil the play for you, ends up dead. Cordelia is described as a principled person, but is described by one of the scholars of loneliness as the first truly lonely self in the modern sense. She is lonely in the sense that she is isolated and self-judging. She is not just sad and not just pushed away by her own family. She is also someone who judges and understands her own responsibility for her own loneliness. Along with Shakespeare, we have the pictures of Albrecht Durer, the great German writer who describes positive forms of solitude. There have been throughout the ages, but Durer describes in one picture, which you can see on the screen now, Saint Jerome in his study. Saint Jerome is accompanied by a lion, a dog, I believe, representing faith, and a skull representing mortality, but he is describing a way in which he can be in solitude with in a saintly way, an ecstasy, a going beyond himself. Durer also describes a failed ecstasy, a sort of bored independence, a bored solitude, a failed ecstasy in his picture, describing melancholia, in which a winged person, perhaps an angel, sits with the most bored possible expression, with all the arts, with all the tools of creativity around them, and yet unable to do anything with them. It's the boredom that waits for death, as Walter Benjamin describes it. It's also rather like a very modern sense of solitude, where people have so much social media that they end up, as Michael O'Sullivan, one of the participants in our symposium, describes as interconnected loners. We have all the technology to connect, we are interconnected, and yet we are suffering in solitude. So solitude can be described positively, it has been described positively and negatively. By the early 19th century, we have a sort of transition, whereas in ancient and early modern times, the punishment of solitude was being sent away by and into exile, and most ecstasy was in your own study, in your own home, or in your own religious community. This was swapped around. The cities were becoming alienated places, where one seemed to be in exile from oneself, in a factory, in a city, and people often went off into the countryside, into nature, to find their ecstasy. So they went away to find ecstasy, as in Wordsworth's description of his walk in the countryside, when he noticed some daffodils and finds a bliss of solitude whilst walking in the countryside. You have all of that alongside, through the 19th century, the growth of the alienation from oneself, the self-exile, as a result of social forms. In the modern world, we have both ecstasy and exile in both forms. We have still huge numbers of refugees, huge numbers of dispossessed diaspora all around the world, suffering in solitude away from their countries, as Ovid did, but we also have an alienation, a postmodern alienation in various forms. We have positive forms of solitude in our studies, in our homes, our ability to cut off from people in positive ways, but we also go out into nature. There's deep ecology movements, ways of gaining positive solitude out of that. So all those traditions are present today, including the religious traditions. And I must mention Julian of Norwich, one of the great writers who herself, throughout all her adult life, lived in solitude as an anchoress, lived literally bricked into a single room on the side of a church, and yet wrote about people and wrote about life and wrote about religion in a eloquent way, and found positive forms of solitude that many try to copy today. Silence, having talked about briefly about solitude, silence is in some ways, and I'm one of the people who will celebrate that as a form of solitude, as a particular form of solitude that is oral and aural disengagement. Solitude is a sort of disengagement, whether it's intentional or imposed upon people. If you do not talk, you are being silent. If you cannot or do not listen, you are experiencing silence. So oral and aural disengagement is a lot of what the literature on silence describes. And silence, like solitude, can be positive or negative, can be chosen and can be imposed on people. And ultimately, for most people, it's impossible to achieve. It's impossible to be completely in solitude, and it's impossible to experience complete silence. Ironically, the people who are unable to understand and experience silence are those who have no hearing at all and who have never had hearing. Those people are no more able to describe silence than a stone could describe silence. You have to be able to hear in order to describe silence. And silence is more associated than the other two terms, I think, with the ineffable, with the indescribable, with the difficult to describe. At the end of his first great philosophical work, the philosopher Wittgenstein writes at the very end, the final words are, "What we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence." Now, some people say that that means that once philosophy has got rid of ethics, got rid of religion, everything else is pointless. However, Jonathan Ray has, I think, rather better described Wittgenstein's position. Let's see if Wittgenstein, there he is. Wittgenstein's position, as far as Wittgenstein was concerned, the fact that ethical and religious attitudes fall outside the limits of articulate thought was not their weakness, but their glory. In other words, his silence was a silence of wonder. And silence has that characteristic to it, or can have that characteristic to it. Helen Lees, who would like to be with us and is unable to be with us, but writes a lot about silence and writes about the weak and the strong silence, the imposed silence and the silence we choose for ourselves. She also writes about techniqued and untechniqued silence. There were people at this symposium talking about mindfulness and other techniques of gaining silence, but untechniqued silence can be the simple sitting quietly in a room, walking quietly through the countryside. All of these are different forms of silence. In music, I think of all the arts describes, ironically enough, describes silence better, probably, better than anything else. There is a famous piano piece by John Cage, the American composer, called 4 minutes 33 seconds. It is a piece where the pianist sits at the piano for 4 minutes 33 seconds and doesn't play a note. It's famous as in some way for some people as a musical joke, but it's not a joke for him. It's a way of understanding what silence can be, and a way of people in the audience listening to the coughs and breathing and other ambient sounds that are around him, around her, rather than simply concentrating on what the pianist is doing. He wrote a whole book on silence and described how he performed his piece in the middle of the countryside. He says how I have spent many pleasant hours in the woods conducting performances of my silent piece. At one performance, I passed the first movement by attempting the identification of a mushroom, which remained successfully unidentified. The second movement was extremely dramatic, beginning with the sounds of a buck and doe leaping up to within 10 feet of my rocky podium. The third movement was a return to the theme of the first. In other words, identifying mushrooms. He saw his silent piece as something that could be performed anywhere. His was describing the art of silence, the art of even a famous composer being able to be silent and therefore observe and watch and listen to what else is going on in the world. A more subtle description of silence would be difficult to describe. Kierkegaard describes silence, the philosopher, as being like in the Bible there is a story of being like the lilies and the birds, and he says the difference between the lilies and the birds and people is that people are able to talk so much that their being quiet is that much more of an art and requires that much more effort or technique or concentration than it does for the lilies or the birds. And I think Cage describes that rather well. The final of the three terms that I want to say something about is loneliness. Loneliness can be described in so many different ways. It can be described as simply a situation, an experience, but most people, not all, but most people would describe it as an emotion. And unlike solitude and unlike silence, as an emotion, it consists of two parts. It consists of a feeling, an affect, which is negative, and I've yet to find a form of loneliness described where it's described as entirely a positive experience. There are good things that come out of loneliness, but it always involves some suffering or pain. But it combines that as an emotion with an interpretation of that emotion. It's only arrived in the literature in its modern form particularly through the 19th century. And I would describe it as an emotion, a pain, a form of suffering, accompanied by the idea of love that is now absent, something one wants or one loves that is now absent, when that pain is accompanied by some self-rejection, for example, because the absence is thought to be deserved. Now, that is the three-dimensional view of loneliness that I think emerged through the 19th century and into the 20th century. Three elements to it: separation, rejection, both of which are found in exile as well, but also self-rejection, some sense of guilt or responsibility for this. And that's how I would describe loneliness. There is a much larger literature on loneliness than on either solitude or silence, and that includes a literary forms of loneliness, which is one of the best ways of tracing how the emotion emerged and where it is now. There are wonderful descriptions of loneliness as we would now understand it, sad, desperately sad descriptions of loneliness in the work of the poet Hölderlin, a German poet who sank later in the second half of his life into what would now is now described as a form of schizophrenia, living on his own, looked after by a family, but living in a room on his own. He writes himself, "Tell me, is it a blessing or a curse, this loneliness which is part of my nature and which I am irresistibly driven back into?" He describes a sort of emotional loneliness, a modern loneliness really, and one that accompanied his increasing isolation. Sometimes it's described, his life is described as a rather romantic withdrawal into silence. His friend and biographer, the first biographer of him, described it, I think, rather better as a form of a terrifying form of perdition. The young man, Weiblinger, describes how he once discovered among his papers a terrifying phrase, replete with mystery. After honouring the renown of a list of Greek heroes and the beauty of the realm of gods, he says, "Now for the first time I understand humankind because I dwell far from it and in solitude." A desperately sad form of what could reasonably be, he described in German as loneliness. Other poets through the 19th century and other novelists like Mary Shelley describe loneliness. The novel Frankenstein is very different from the film of Frankenstein. In the novel, the creature created by Frankenstein is a lonely creature. He is not only isolated from people, but he is self-loathing and ends with committing suicide, unlike the creature in the film. That's the creature as described in the Shelley novel. The Bronte sisters, three Bronte sisters, two of them wrote brilliantly, perhaps all three of them, about loneliness. Charlotte Bronte wrote Jane Eyre, Emily Bronte wrote Wuthering Heights. Both of these are about isolation turning to loneliness. In Jane Eyre, this is slightly resolved towards the end of the novel. In Wuthering Heights, it ends in tragedy for everyone. Later in the century, George Eliot writes of a loneliness that is rather more domestic. In a novel like Middlemarch, the heroine of Middlemarch and her husband are both good examples of a very modern inward form of lonely suffering. For myself, I think the greatest writer on loneliness is Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson writes of a whole range of lonelinesses. One of her poems is called Another Loneliness. She describes a whole range of forms of loneliness, from those that are quite creative forms of loneliness to those which are profoundly negative, terrifying, and more terrifying to her even than the grave. More terrifying than pitiable, she says, is the loneliness one dare not sound. She even manages to talk about the taboo nature of loneliness itself.
Excuse me, Julian, I'd like to remind you that you've got 4 minutes left.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anna. And I'm on time as well, remarkably. The American tradition that Dickinson represents was followed up through the 19th century by descriptions both of loneliness and what is described as lonesomeness, which can be a little more positive. People like Mark Twain writes about solid lonesomeness, a sort of uncomfortable and yet quite creative form of solitude. But later into the 20th century, the lonesome cowboys described by the earlier novelists became, in the songs of Hank Williams, a lonesomeness that really is lonely. Hank Williams is one of his best known songs, I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry, was described by Elvis Presley as the saddest song I've ever heard. It is a desperately sad song. Similar emotions are described in the words of African-American blues artists. People like Robert Johnson describes in the blues a similar range of emotions as those described by Hank Williams and as described in the form of loneliness. The author, the scholar McGeechee, describes a comparison between African-American blues lyrics and Anglo-Saxon poetry of exile in a wonderfully arcane piece of research that I think is very powerful. Later in the 20th century, John Lennon, in a song called Your Blues, a sort of Liverpudlian version of the blues, he describes the blues not at all. He never uses the word blues. He talks about being lonely. He talks about a suicidal loneliness. The Beatles, and John Lennon in particular, are known for such upbeat pop songs. People forget that they were often singing about suicide, as Lennon was singing about suicide in that song. And so the tradition of lonely descriptions of loneliness, of the blues, and so on, have filled literature particularly for the last 2 centuries. I'm coming to a conclusion now, and my voice is going. I need more coffee. I'll try and get some coffee in between. The lost love of loneliness is something that many of us would describe. There's a growing body of research on solitude, silence and loneliness, well represented today at our symposium, from various academic perspectives and practitioner perspectives, policy perspectives. The disciplines and fields where I found valuable work in education, philosophy, psychology, theology, history, sociology, and so on, they tend to be rather isolated. They're like islands of research. I would like, and we would like, Gosha and I and the organizer of this symposium and many others involved in our work would like to make an alliance, would like to see these islands as becoming more like an archipelago, joining together in a form of alliance, bringing disciplines, life stages and cultures together, bringing researchers together, writing and talking together, and bringing practice settings together, health settings, gerontology, education settings, and so on. All of this, as far as I'm concerned, and I'm an educationist, helps create a sense of lifelong learning of aloneness alongside togetherness. We learn personhood alone and together. This is not just a matter of educational institutions, but of lifelong learning. A number of us here today are involved in writing a handbook, the Bloomsbury Handbook of Solitude, Silence and Loneliness, which is trying to give describe academically the alliance of different disciplines and different views and different positions on these three terms. But we'd also like to set up, and we have set up, and we'll invite everyone here to join us if you would like to, the International Society for Research on Solitude, the ISRS, to try and bring some more strength and mutual understanding to the variety of disciplines involved in aloneness studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian, for your presentation, for your delightful presentation. And it shows us how fascinating subject loneliness, silence, and solitude are. And I expect that some of us have questions for you. I can hear the hands up. So we have 15 minutes for the discussion. And as I see, Torgert has his hands up. So please switch off microphone and ask the question.
All right. Hang on. Can you hear now? No?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, it's a bit.
But
it's a bit
we can see
here.
only a half of your. Oh, now the whole
Yeah.
face. Okay, thank you.
That is due to the equipment. But can you hear now?
Yes.
Because it says here it's muted. Okay, so it's not muted. All right. That was a brilliant presentation. Thank you very much. It's a question about your interesting analysis of John Cage. Yeah. You know, in musicology today, contemporary musicology, there is a whole new tradition that explores music that is made through sort of random measures. Yeah, rain that's falling, or just, you know, people walking by and so on, which sort of comes out of John Cage's very novel approach. I would like to ask you, when it comes to solitude and silence and so on, does this have something to do with relinquishing control over our, over our contexts?
Yes, would be my short. It can do. It is not always. I think that's what Kierkegaard was saying. There is an art to silence, and I would say there is an art or a skill of solitude, that it requires us not to do something, not to speak or not to listen, not to be with our immediate concerns. I think a lot of people find solitude not so they are away from all people, but so they are away from their immediate living people. People find in romantic novels, they find solitude in a graveyard often. This is because they wish to think about and talk to the long dead. They wish to be in communion with long distant or long dead people. Children will daydream. They are in solitude in their house, and yet they are far away. They will be described often as in another world. They relinquish their current world, their immediate concerns, as you would describe it, I think often, in order to gain a solitude. I don't think the same is true of loneliness, which is more a imposed reduction in power, reduction in connection. But I think that's a beautiful way of describing it. Yes.
Okay. I can hear Sarah keep her hands up. So could you ask the question, Sarah?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that talk, Julian. I suppose I was interested in what you said about needing to hear in order for silence to be possible. And I suppose I was just thinking about how that might be expanded to other kind of multimodal articulation of that, the different senses. I suppose particularly thinking that deaf people do hear in a certain sense, if you know, there's a lot of semiotic meaning in their world that they could retreat from and experience silence in that sense. And then I suppose it opens up the possibility of sort of retreat and abstention from kind of different sensory modalities in different ways. So I just wondered if you had anything to say about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's fascinating. I do think broadly, although I find silence the hardest of the three, all three are, I find, impossible to pin down, but silence is, I find, particularly associated with the ineffable, the indescribable, as a positive thing and not simply a disengagement. But in the sense of silence as a form of solitude, silence as a disengagement, and I see solitude not as being apart, but as disengaging of some sort of, whether it's forced or voluntary, some sort of experiential, oral, all the senses, some sort of disengagement from things. If you put headphones on listening to music in your family home, you are disengaging, even though you're listening to things, but you're disengaging intentionally, or just reading a book, you may be disengaging. And I think silence is a, in one sense at least, is precisely that, a modal form of that multimodal solitude. So that's how I would describe it. Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. I can read a lot of comments on our chat that it was great presentation and the fantastic beginning of our conference. And also Wong mentioned about deaf and mute people and the silence connected with their situation. So maybe you'd like to comment something, Julian, as I can't see any questions more.
I think it's interesting, the mute community. Yeah, absolutely, there's certainly, and it's PH asking about the deaf mute. Hello, PH. It's good to see you. Good to have you here with us. I think there is a separate issue about muteness. I think in popular literature and the novel series The Silence of the Lambs is one of the worst offenders, where Hannibal Lecter was what was called an elective mute following abuse during his childhood, and this is then associated with his later murderous tendencies. Actually, research on muteness suggests it is not usually associated with terrible trauma of that, anything like that sort of thing. There are all sorts of subtle issues to do with muteness. I think silence is, you say, is the silence untethered to physical sound? I don't think so, in the sense that I can't see how silence is untethered to, if we had no sense of hearing from birth, silence would have no meaning. And so silence for me is tethered to physical sound, and yet it is a form of solitude, for me, a form of solitude. So people who have never heard things can be in solitude, and we can call it a silence. If they do not, if someone does not communicate with people, we can say they're being silent. But if they are physically incapable of hearing sound, it's a different sort of silence. And I would probably rather describe it as a form of solitude, voluntary solitude. But yeah, silence. Frantz Fanon talks about the silencing of colonialized nations. It can be a political silence, it can be an institutional silence. We all in different institutions understand that in some ways we may be silenced, we may be unable to speak of things politically, socially, in various ways. So it is much broader than sound, or it echoes into things other than mere sound. But I still think sound's there somewhere.
Thank you, Julian. Henrietta is hesitated if we have time for another questions, but I think that we've got 5 minutes left. So ask Henrietta to ask your question. Henrietta, are you with us?
Yes. Just a moment. Sorry. Hello.
Okay. Hello.
Hello, Henrietta.
Thank you for your introduction, Julian. It was very interesting and substantial, and I think it was a wonderful introduction to almost everything that it's going to follow up in this conference. I was wondering about the let's say the case of Madame Bovary. What do you think about it? Is it a case of loneliness? Is it a case of estrangement? Is it a case of aloneness?
Thank you, Henrietta. I didn't hear the crucial bit when you said the case of, and I didn't hear that.
Flaubert, Madame Bovary of Flaubert.
Madame Bovary. I am no expert on Madame Bovary. What do you think? She is certainly. My first reaction would be to say it's an enforced social estrangement, a sort of an exile, an enforced exile. How does she experience it? What are the emotions attached? I guess it's partly loneliness, because she has, as I understand it, please tell me, I don't know the novel well. She does experience it as a sense of her own fault in some sense. She blames herself, I think, which for me would be partly what makes it loneliness.
Okay. My personal interpretation is based on the fact that the writer himself said that Madame Bovary, c'est moi. Madame Bovary, it's myself. So deriving from that, I would say that partially the manner of not being content with whatever is presented to us as an enforced social and personal circumstance, and trying to overcome that and at least dream about more, if not enrich it in a more actual way. That's my interpretation. So it's partially loneliness derived from a sort of not daydreaming and not ambition, but more of aspiration for more substance, for more meaning in life. That's my interpretation.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Julian.
And I think it's worth saying, I think loneliness in literature is often associated with sexuality, whether it's gay sex or missing sex or inappropriate sex and whatever. Loneliness in literature through to the middle of the 20th century, late 19th through to the middle of the 20th century, often associates loneliness and sexuality. And Helen Saunstone, who's one of the people with whom we work, writes about the silencing of sexuality.
Difference in general, yes.
And this is true of many societies, and it's argued over, I know in Poland, and I know in the UK, and I know in other countries, the argument over how or whether one is silenced and how silent one should be. The American phrase, don't ask, don't tell, which was used in the military about sexuality, is a wonderful, eloquent description of silencing. That is, each person involved is complicit in. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. There are some more comments on our chat, but as people mentioned, we do not have much time to develop the questions and discussion. So at that moment, I say you thank you once again, Julian, and it was the pleasure to listen to you. For me personally, this combination with our life and art, and I would love to make my life at least a piece of art. And thank you a lot. Thank you a lot.
Thank you.
And then we've got 15 minutes or 10 minutes break, and then at 10:15 we start 3 parallel sessions. So we have to log out from this general channel and then log in the channel of the group we'd like to attend the meeting. So thank you a lot once again for Julian and for all of you. It was the pleasure to listen to you, and I will meet in the during the other discussions and other groups. Thank you a lot.
Thank you. Thank you, Anya.